right? This is still a motorcycle. You perceive it as a motorcycle, not as something you can pick up and put in your pocket because it's only this big, right? Same thing applies to an airplane that's like out there in the sky. You don't perceive it as an object that you can interact with, but you just take that information as an index of how far or how close the object is. So because we have this kind of relationship between depth and size, and we can readily extract distance information from the image size, we can then relate objects together. So relative size here tells us that between these two motorcycles, this is farther away because it appears smaller than this one. Or these two humans, right? One of them is farther away because a human has a pretty average size and it takes up so much of your retinal space if it's placed at a certain distance. Again, what I'm really rushing over are a set of very complex computations that your brain is constantly, on a moment-to-moment basis, carrying out in order to update you with an accurate estimate of what's out there in the world. And yet, we don't have to really think about this at all. This is all background processing, or what we call unconscious processes that underlie visual perception. So these are three of maybe a few or a handful of things that we talked about. Another potent cue is what I referred to also in the previous image, and that has to do with coming together of parallel lines at a very far distance. We call this perspective convergence, and there are 2-3 examples of it here. So we know that the road doesn't really end back there because why would it? It's a road of a fixed width, right? And that's how it looks into the distance, because we might have actually traveled to the end of some of these roads at some point, and we realize that just because we see it end like that doesn't mean that it actually does end like that. So the same thing is true of these parallel lines of the railroad, or these grout lines of these tiles on a man-made surface. All of them are indicating that the reason the lines are coming together is that the distance is increasing, and that the closer they get to one another, it means that they're looking farther and farther into space. So what else can we say about these pictorial cues? Another one is called aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective, and that's simply the bluish tint that farther objects take on when you look into the distance. Right? Somebody has to point these things out or explicitly mention them, but it's something that we all use as information to understand that this part of the world is farther away than this part. Aside from the relative height and so on, if you notice, there's a bluish tint that is part and parcel with everything over here. The mountain, the dirt, the vegetation, and so on. Except that becomes a function of distance. So the more of that bluish tint you have, the farther things are. The less of it you have, the closer things are. And another potent cue is called texture gradient, and that's the degree of granularity of a surface as a function of distance again. So if a surface is made up of, relatively speaking, units of a certain size. In this case, this is a naturally occurring surface, but you can pick up a tiled floor, right? In fact, we could just go back here and you'll see what I'm talking about. Right? So the surface is made up of these units, these rectangular units, put together in a very orderly fashion. When you look into the distance, the spacing between the units becomes smaller as a result of distance. So that's what we call texture gradient. So there's a gradient along this dimension. So again, I want to point out that there isn't really any third dimension per se in this image, but that you're actually reconstructing it, you're extracting it from the image And it's an interpretation of what you're seeing, without really having to think about it. Lastly, shading becomes a very potent cue. So again, this is knowledge that we've gathered from many years of many centuries, maybe even eons of having lived under the sun. Usually, the source of light is above us, not below us. And the way objects cast their shadows is if they're protruding from a surface, the shadow is cast under the object. So when you look at an arrangement of dots on a flat surface like this, you have a sense of seeing these as being sort of bulges or protrusions from the surface. Right? And these are indentations in the surface. Why? Because again, if there is light coming from the top, it will light up the bottom half and leave dark the top half of these types of surfaces. So even though there is absolutely no depth information, no third dimension there, you are seeing something that looks like 3D. Now what happens if I turn this around on its head, maybe a couple of times so you guys can see what happens to your perception of depth? Right? So with proper shading, the same image rotated, let's say just 180 degrees, looks like these protrusions are now indentations, and these indentations, the whole column, turn into protrusions, bulges on the wall. Right? The other thing I could do is show you, I don't know why my mouse kind of died on me, because of battery issues, but I could use the shadow, so that's about shading, but I could use the shadow of this object to also show you how important these two sources of information are. And they all emerge from basically our understanding of how. So keep looking at that square, and I'm going to change the position of the shadow, and you tell me what your impression of the depth is, if you like to participate. So here is the object flat on the surface, if you will. Oh, I need to select it first. No, that wouldn't work. That would take me too. It's okay, thank you. Now, here. So, look what's happening to the object. Okay, so all I did was to pull that shadow basically down and to the side. And it seems that the object is lifting off from the surface, or getting closer to you, so to speak. So again, another type of interpretation of the environment. You look at something, you relate its shadow to itself, to the object, and then you make a decision about where the object is positioned in space, based again on the two-dimensional retinal image. So what else can we say? The next one is a little bit, I think, I put the next slide in with hesitation because it has more to do with the science behind this than the actual message that I wanted to convey, but we'll see if this one stops. It's basically a manipulation of shadows and positioning to really